Right now, one man can end human civilization in about 30 minutes. Not metaphorically, not theoretically, literally 30 minutes from decision to detonation. He keeps the launch codes in a briefcase called the nuclear football. It never leaves his side. A military aide carries it everywhere he goes, to restaurants, to golf courses, to the bathroom, presumably. He doesn't need a court order to use it. He doesn't need a vote. He doesn't need anyone's permission. Just a decision and a phone call, and the world as we know it is over before your next meal. That man is the President of the United States, and by most measures, he is the most powerful person alive today. But here's the thing. By the standards of actual history, he's basically an intern. A well-dressed intern with very good benefits and access to a terrifying briefcase, but an intern nonetheless. Because there are people throughout history who make every modern leader look like they are running a lemonade stand on a Tuesday afternoon. And the craziest part is, most of them you already know, but you don't know the full story. And the full story is where it gets genuinely insane. So let's go back in time, all the way back, and find the most powerful person who ever lived. We start in the present because we need a benchmark. Elon Musk right now controls Starlink, the satellite internet infrastructure that covers over 70 countries. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Ukrainian soldiers were using Starlink to coordinate battlefield movements in real time. Elon personally decided how much coverage Ukraine got. Not a government, not a treaty. One man with a satellite constellation decided the communication capacity of a country at war. He also owns the rocket company that NASA depends on to get astronauts to space. He owns the most valuable car company in history. He runs an AI company, and at various points, he has been the richest person on the planet. He's not elected, he doesn't answer to a parliament, he doesn't serve a term, he just operates. One man, one decision, half the world's internet. But Elon still has the SEC breathing down his neck. He still has shareholders, he still has competitors. There is still a system around him that pushes back occasionally when he does something truly unhinged. He's accountable, at least a little. We need to go back to when accountability didn't exist, when the system wasn't around you because you were the system. The year is 1966. China is in the middle of what Mao Zedong called the Cultural Revolution, which sounds civilized until you find out what it actually was. Mao decided that Chinese society was too infected with old ideas, old culture, old habits. So he launched a nationwide campaign to destroy all of it. Teachers were publicly humiliated, intellectuals were sent to labor camps, doctors were forced to clean toilets, schools closed for years. The entire educated class of a nation was dismantled by government order. And Mao could do this because he commanded 900 million people. To put that in perspective, that is more than the entire population of Europe and North America combined at the time. Every single one of those 900 million people answered to one man. But this is not even the most insane thing Mao did with that power. A few years earlier, in 1958, Mao looked at his grain harvest numbers and decided they were too low. And he figured out why. Sparrows. Specifically, sparrows were eating the grain. So Mao launched the Four Pests campaign and ordered every single person in China to kill sparrows. 900 million people were instructed to find sparrows and eliminate them. People banged drums and pots outside sparrow nests so the birds couldn't land and died of exhaustion mid-flight. They destroyed eggs, they killed chicks, they chased flocks until the birds dropped from the sky. And it worked. The sparrow population collapsed. The problem is that sparrows don't just eat grain, they also eat the insects that eat grain. With the sparrows gone, locust populations exploded. Crops were devastated. Combined with other disastrous agricultural policies, China entered one of the worst famines in human history. Between 15 and 55 million people starved to death.
One man decided sparrows were the problem. Tens of millions of people died because of a bird. That is not power in the abstract sense. That is power in the most visceral, terrifying, real sense. The ability to be catastrophically wrong about something as small as a sparrow and have the entire country pay for it. Let's go back 150 years. 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte has already redrawn the map of Europe so many times the cartographers can barely keep up. At his peak, he directly or indirectly controlled most of continental Europe, from Spain in the west to the borders of Russia in the east, an empire stretching across 3 million square kilometers. He personally commanded armies of 600,000 men, the Grande Armée, soldiers who would march through blizzards, cross frozen rivers, eat their horses, and keep going, because Napoleon said go, and they went. The loyalty wasn't just military discipline. Soldiers genuinely believed Napoleon was something beyond a normal man. He had been shot at so many times without dying that his troops thought he was literally unkillable. He was also reshaping civilization while he was at it. Between battles, Napoleon was writing laws. The Napoleonic Code, his rewrite of the French legal system, established concepts like equality before the law, property rights, and religious freedom that were radical at the time. Today, over 50 countries still use legal systems directly based on the Napoleonic Code. Every time a French-speaking country processes a legal case, Napoleon is technically still in the room. He did all of this before he turned 40. When most people are still figuring out their career, Napoleon had conquered a continent and rewired its legal DNA. He had one problem: Russia. In 1812, Napoleon marched 600,000 soldiers east into Russia. It was the largest invasion force in the history of warfare at that point. He expected a quick, decisive campaign. Russia gave him something different. They retreated and burned everything behind them. Every village, every supply depot, every field of grain. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, Moscow was on fire. There was nothing to conquer, no food, no shelter, just cold and smoke and 600,000 men who needed to eat. He turned his army around and marched back west through a Russian winter that dropped to -37 degrees. Of the 600,000 men who marched into Russia, roughly 100,000 came home. The most powerful military force in the world, defeated not by a better army, but by weather and a country willing to destroy itself to win. Let's go back another 700 years. 1095, Pope Urban II is standing in a field in Clermont, France, addressing a crowd. He gives a speech, just a speech. He says that Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christianity, is under Muslim control, and that God wants Christians to take it back. He says that anyone who dies on this mission will have their sins forgiven, eternal salvation in exchange for military service. Within months, not years, months, somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people from across Europe began walking toward the Middle East. Farmers left their fields mid-harvest. Knights sold their estates. Entire families packed up and left for a journey of over 3,000 miles on foot through hostile territory. No internet, no army drafting them, no salary, just a speech from a man they believed spoke for God. This is the thing that makes medieval papal power incomprehensible to a modern mind. Today, if a leader wants you to do something dangerous, they have to pay you, draft you, or threaten you. The Pope didn't need any of that. He had something more powerful than money or guns. He had your soul. The Church taught that after death, you faced eternal judgment, heaven or hell, forever. And the Pope had the authority, in the eyes of hundreds of millions of people, to determine which one you got. He could excommunicate you, cut you off from the sacraments, and in the theology of the time, that meant you were going to hell when you died. Not prison, not exile, eternal damnation. Kings feared this, emperors feared this. In 1077, Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV stood barefoot in the snow outside a castle for 3 days in January in penance, waiting for Pope Gregory VII to lift his excommunication. The most powerful political ruler in Europe stood in the snow for 3 days because a religious leader had cut him off from God. That is not political leverage. That is a completely different category of power. And it worked because everyone believed it. The Pope didn't need tanks. He had something tanks cannot touch. Now, let's go back even further to a man who understood power in the most purely territorial sense of all. 1206, a man named Temujin unifies the Mongol tribes of Central Asia and takes the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. It wasn't ego, it was a job description. At its peak, the Mongol Empire covered 24 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, Africa is 30 million square kilometers. The Mongol Empire was roughly the size of Africa. In terms of contiguous landmass, it remains the largest empire in human history, and Genghis built most of it within his own lifetime. The military tactics were unlike anything the world had seen. The Mongols were the first army to use psychological warfare at scale. They would send messengers to cities before arriving, offering a simple deal: surrender and be spared, resist and be destroyed. If a city surrendered, the Mongols kept their word remarkably often. If a city resisted, they were annihilated so completely and so publicly that the next city usually surrendered without a fight. This is how a relatively small population of nomadic steppe warriors conquered kingdoms, empires, and civilizations 10 times their size, not just by being better soldiers, by being smarter about how fear works. But Genghis had one power that rarely gets discussed: the Silk Road. The ancient trade network connecting China to Europe ran directly through Mongol territory, all of it. The spices, the silk, the gold, the ideas, everything that moved between East and West passed through land that Genghis controlled. He was essentially the landlord of the entire ancient global economy. He could tax it, he could close it, he could redirect it. In an era before satellites or undersea cables, controlling the physical routes of communication and commerce meant controlling the flow of information and wealth across 2 continents. Genghis Khan was running the ancient version of controlling the internet, the stock exchange, and the highway system simultaneously. He also did something unusual for a conqueror of his era. He practiced religious tolerance across his empire. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamans all operated freely under Mongol rule, not because Genghis was particularly enlightened, but because a stable, diverse empire was more profitable than a constantly rebellious one. Even his enemies admitted he was brilliant, which somehow made him more terrifying. Now let's go to Rome. 44 BC. Julius Caesar has just been assassinated on the floor of the Senate by 23 senators who stabbed him a combined 23 times. The Republic is in chaos, civil war breaks out, and from the wreckage emerges a 19-year-old named Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, who, through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and ruthless elimination of rivals, becomes the first Roman emperor. History will know him as Augustus. Let's be precise about what Augustus actually controlled. The Roman Empire, at its height under Augustus, covered 5 million square kilometers and contained somewhere between 50 and 90 million people, roughly a quarter of the entire global population at the time. Every single one of those people paid taxes to Rome. Rome's army, the most professional and technologically advanced fighting force on the planet, answered to one man. But the really extraordinary thing about Augustus wasn't just the scale of his power, it was how he engineered it. He was technically not a king, he was technically not a dictator. He called himself princeps, first citizen. He maintained the forms of the republic. The Senate still met, elections still happened, laws still passed, but every meaningful decision flowed through Augustus. He controlled the army, the treasury, the provinces, and the courts. He built a system where the appearance of democracy maintained social peace, while actual power was entirely concentrated in one person. The Senate passed laws, and Augustus decided whether they happened. And then he made himself a god. Not metaphorically, officially. After his death, the Senate voted to declare him divine. But while he was alive, he was already being worshipped in the eastern provinces. Temples were built to him. Prayers were offered to him. His face was on every coin minted across 3 continents. Every time someone in Britain bought bread, or someone in Egypt paid a soldier, or someone in Syria traded goods, they handled a coin with Augustus's face on it. His image was literally the currency of reality. He ruled for 40 years, and when he died, Rome had been so thoroughly reorganized around his presence that it took centuries for it to fully unravel. The US president today governs about 4% of the world's population with a term limit of 8 years. Augustus governed 25% of the world's population for 40 years and was worshipped as a god while doing it.
But before the emperors and the popes and the khans, there was a young man from Macedonia who moved faster than any of them, and whose shadow we are still living in. Alexander the Great. Born 356 BC, king of Macedon at age 20 after his father Philip II was assassinated. At the time, Macedon was a relatively minor kingdom on the northern edge of Greece. By the time Alexander died 13 years later, at age 32, he had conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen. From Greece through Turkey down into Egypt, where he was declared a god and founded Alexandria, the city that would become the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Then east through Persia, the dominant superpower of the time, an empire that had existed for 200 years, which Alexander destroyed in 3 years. Then further east through Afghanistan, through the Himalayan passes and into northern India, further east than any Greek had ever gone. He never lost a battle. In 13 years of continuous warfare across 22,000 miles of territory, Alexander did not lose a single engagement. When you read about his battles, Gaugamela, Hydaspes, Issus, historians still struggle to explain how he did what he did with the forces he had. At Gaugamela, he defeated a Persian army that outnumbered him somewhere between 5-1 and 10-1, depending on which historian you believe. But here is the thing about Alexander that separates him from every other conqueror in history. The land he took didn't stay conquered, it transformed. Everywhere Alexander went, he built cities, over 70 cities bearing his name or founded by his order. These weren't military outposts, they were planned urban centers designed to blend Greek and local culture. Greek became the lingua franca, the common language of the entire known world, from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. Greek philosophy, Greek architecture, Greek science and mathematics spread across 3 continents, not because Alexander forced them on people at sword point, but because they came packaged with trade and education and opportunity. When the Romans took over the Greek world, they became so influenced by Greek culture that educated Romans considered Greek the language of sophistication. The New Testament was written in Greek. The early Islamic scholars who preserved and advanced mathematics, medicine, and astronomy worked largely from Greek texts. The Renaissance in Europe was triggered in part by the rediscovery of Greek ideas. Every step of that chain traces back to a 20-year-old king from Macedonia who decided to go east and never stop. 2,300 years after his death, the world is still operating inside the intellectual framework that Alexander's conquests spread across civilization. He didn't just conquer land, he reprogrammed the human mind at a civilizational scale. And he did it by 32. So who is the most powerful person in history? Let's look at what we have.
Elon Musk controls the infrastructure of the modern world, but operates inside a system that constrains him. His power is enormous, but it has edges. Mao Zedong commanded nearly 1 billion people and proved that absolute power over a population means your mistakes kill millions. His power was total, but also blind. Napoleon rewrote the laws of civilization and commanded the loyalty of armies through personal magnetism alone, but even he hit the wall that stops everyone eventually. Pope Urban II moved 100,000 people across a continent with a speech because he controlled something no army can threaten, the fear of what happens after you die. Genghis Khan controlled more land than anyone in history and ran the entire global economy of his era through dominance of the Silk Road. Augustus Caesar ruled a quarter of the world for 40 years while being officially worshipped as a god. Alexander the Great conquered the known world in 13 years without a single loss, and then left behind an intellectual legacy that shaped every civilization that came after him. Looking at that list, most people would say it is Genghis or Augustus or Alexander, and by the numbers, territory, population, duration, they are probably right. But here is the thing about the numbers that don't capture. In 1913, John D. Rockefeller was worth 2% of the entire U.S. GDP. That made him proportionally richer than any billionaire today. But the U.S. economy in 1913 was 22 times smaller than it is now. Bigger slice, much smaller pie. The same logic applies to power. Genghis Khan ruled 24 million square kilometers of largely empty steppe and farmland, with a combined economic output that would be a rounding error in today's global economy. Augustus Caesar ruled 25% of the world's population, but the entire world's population was 300 million people. Today, that would be 2 billion people. Modern China alone has more people than Augustus's entire world. Alexander's intellectual legacy is real and profound, but he operated in a world where ideas spread at the speed of a horse. A single viral video today reaches more people in 24 hours than Alexander reached in his entire life. Every generation has more people, more resources, more reach, more leverage than the one before it. The pie keeps getting bigger, and the person who controls the biggest slice of the biggest pie that has ever existed is the most powerful person in history by definition. Which means the most powerful person in history doesn't live in the past. They exist right now. Or they haven't been born yet. And that's the thing about power that history keeps showing us. Every era produces someone who makes the previous era look small. Every century has its Alexander or its Caesar or its Khan, and they never look the way everyone expected them to look. The most powerful person in history is not sitting on a throne made of gold. They might be sitting on a plastic chair in a garage right now, or in a dorm room, or in a village somewhere that nobody has heard of yet, with an idea that will reprogram how the world thinks, just like the last one did.